Hey, good morning, everyone. Rick Soukoulis here. Going to do a little bit of mortgage math this morning. But first, I want to give a shout out to Hannah Mears. She encouraged me this weekend to get out here and do a little bit of our mortgage math. She said she really enjoyed it. Anyway, listen, let's talk about interest rates. Let's talk about things, mortgages. And I want to attack the Fed this morning. A lot of talk about the Fed. When I say attack the understanding of how it works. And I want to make it simple like I always do with mortgage math. So there's all kinds of detail on the web that you can get into, but I'm going to make this real simple, okay? The Fed's mandate, or what the Fed wants, is to keep inflation at somewhere around 2%. I call this the speed limit or neutral. When the inflation rate's at 2%, your money stays valuable. Things aren't going up in price very quickly. You're not losing savings. It's good. All things are good at that rate. So that's where the Fed wants to keep us. And the way they do that is by moving the Fed funds rate every day, changing the amount, or not every day, but quarterly, changing the amount it costs to borrow from banks. So not getting into what that affects and how it comes into mortgages today, just want to take 4 simple points on a graph, show you inflation and Fed funds, and you can draw your own conclusions. So real quick, I'm going to go back to February 2020. This dot right here is where the Fed fund rate was. Boom, pandemic comes, we go from 1.5% down to 0.03, zero. So the Fed says, things are going to slow down, it's going to be really bad, let's get in front of it and let's drop rates. And bang, they drop rates 1.5% virtually overnight. And so since March of 20, we've been bouncing around with a Fed funds rate of near zero. And we get all the way to February of 22. So 2 full years from 1.5, drop down in 1 month to zero. And for 2 years, we stay real close to zero. So zero is less than that 2% rate, right? Because if the Fed funds rate is at 2 and inflation's at 2, that's the balance they're looking for, to keep those two things working together, because one drives the other. So if inflation rises, you got to rise interest rates to try to bring that inflation down. So now what happens is we get this little disconnect that starts to take place here. In June, things start to shoot up. Then all of a sudden, we see the Fed's funds rate, it starts to climb. Kind of stair steps. Since last February till today, it's at 3%. All right, so that's what the Fed rate has done. But why has it done it? Well, here's inflation. They're tracking together, boom, 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 just like the Fed wants, using the Fed fund rate, staying close, making sure everything's moving in lockstep. Boom, we come over here, and then you can see it starts to widen. All of a sudden, the Fed funds rate is at zero, and inflation's up to 1.5. Starting to move. But we think it's transient. We think it's not going to go anywhere. And as we continue forward, that inflation rate jumps up to over 5% earlier this year. Boom, pops up over 7%. And you can see this gap between these two things is starting to widen. Bang, we're up. 9.1 was the peak of inflation. Now we've tapered back down a little bit. We're at 8.7, so some of this medicine may be working. But if you want to really stomp out inflation, there's one Fed chair that did it successfully, and he threw a lot of rate increases at it. So the gap today is the 3% Fed fund rate and the 8.5, let's call it inflation rate. So the Fed's going to watch. If that inflation rate decelerates or stops, you're going to see the Fed try to use interest rates to slow down inflation. Look, that's the purpose of the Fed raising the rates. This inflation line has to be stopped. And so you decide what you think they might do, next. Do they hold and wait and see what happens? Do they continue to rise? How much medicine do they want to throw at this? And I know a lot of people, it's contra. We got to work on the supply side. We got to look at other things. But, this is the weapon that you use to slow inflation. So listen, that's the reason interest rates have been moving up. This is the goal. So if the goal is 2 and the Fed is able to get the inflation rate to come back down, the spread between Fed funds and mortgage rates, getting back to mortgage math, is usually right around 2%. So when the inflation rate is back to 2, interest rates will be back at around 4. So when will that happen? Keep your eye on the gap between the inflation rate and the Fed funds rate. See if that begins to close. Once it closes, there'll be a period we'll need some stability, and then hopefully things will begin to taper back down again. Anyway, that's how it works. That's a minute of mortgage math. I hope it helps. Talk to you soon.